I answered my phone expecting a normal Tuesday evening, but my mother's voice cut through me like ice. She demanded I sign over the deed to my house to my brother Jake because family comes first. The same family who kicked me out at 18 because they had no space for me when Jake needed the bedroom for his gaming setup. I stared at the legal papers they had already prepared, realizing my family thinks I owe them my entire life's work. The audacity was breathtaking, but what happened next shocked them all. The memory of that awful night 12 years ago still burned in my chest as I hung up the phone. I was Herman Peterson, now 30 years old, sitting in my own living room in my own house that I had bought with my own money. But my mother Carol's words transported me right back to being 18 and homeless. It had started when my younger brother Jake turned 16. Our parents, Robert and Carol Peterson, decided that Jake needed his own space because he was going through what they called a difficult phase. Jake had convinced them to buy him a $3,000 gaming setup, complete with multiple monitors, a custom-built computer, and professional streaming equipment. The problem was, our modest two-bedroom house in suburban Ohio only had space for this elaborate setup in my bedroom. I remember the family meeting like it was yesterday. Dad sat at our kitchen table with his arms crossed, while Mom fidgeted with her coffee mug. They explained that I was old enough to be independent now that I had graduated high school, and Jake really needed the space for his gaming career. They said it with straight faces, as if kicking out their older son to make room for video games was perfectly reasonable. I was working part-time at Henderson's Auto Repair, making minimum wage and barely covering my car insurance and gas money. I had been planning to live at home while attending the local community college, saving money like most of my friends were doing. But Jake wanted my room, and Jake always got what Jake wanted in our house. The night they told me to pack my things, I begged them to reconsider. I offered to sleep on the couch, to give Jake my room and take the basement, anything to stay in my childhood home just a little longer while I figured out my next steps. But Mom said the basement was too damp, and might make Jake's expensive equipment malfunction if we moved it down there. Dad said having me sleep on the couch would interfere with their privacy as a couple. So at 18 years old, I loaded my belongings into garbage bags and drove away in my beat-up Honda Civic. I slept in that car for 3 weeks, parking behind a 24-hour diner where the overnight manager felt sorry for me and sometimes let me use the bathroom to clean up. I showered at the gym with a membership I could barely afford and ate nothing but ramen noodles and day-old sandwiches from the gas station where I worked. Jake, meanwhile, dropped out of community college after 1 semester. He spent the next 5 years in my old bedroom, streaming video games to an audience of 12 people and working part-time jobs that he quit whenever he felt like it. Our parents supported him completely, paying for his food, his games, his equipment upgrades, even his car insurance. I worked double shifts at the auto shop, saved every single penny, and put myself through state college. I studied electrical engineering while living in the cheapest apartment I could find, eating generic brand everything and wearing thrift store clothes. I graduated with a 3.8 GPA and minimal student debt because I had worked my tail off to pay for as much as possible up front. After graduation, I got hired at Morrison Electric, a mid-sized electrical contracting company. I worked my way up from junior technician to project supervisor in 4 years. I lived like a monk, saving 70% of my income, driving my old Honda until it literally died on the highway. For 5 years, I saved every penny I could for one goal: buying my own house. 3 years ago, at age 27, I finally had enough for a down payment on a modest 3-bedroom ranch house in a decent neighborhood. It was not fancy, just 1,200 square feet, with a small yard and a 1-car garage. But it was mine. I had earned every square inch of it through years of sacrifice and hard work. The day I got my keys, I called my parents to share the good news. Mom said that was nice and asked if Jake could come stay with me sometime since he was having trouble finding steady work. I said maybe for a visit, thinking that perhaps my success would motivate him to get his life together. That was my first mistake. But what I discovered Tuesday evening, when my childhood friend Danny Morrison called me, after talking to his mother, shattered everything I thought I knew about my family's perspective on my life. Danny's mom attended the same church as my parents, and she had mentioned to Danny that it was wonderful how the Petersons were letting their son Herman live in their rental property for free while he got back on his feet. Rental property. For free. Getting back on my feet. I drove straight to Danny's house, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Danny showed me the church bulletin from last month, where my father had submitted a prayer request, asking for guidance as he and my mother navigated helping their adult children become independent. The bulletin specifically mentioned their generosity in providing free housing to their older son while their younger son prepared to start his own family. My parents had been telling everyone at church, everyone in their social circle, that I was living in their house. Not just staying with them, but living in a property they owned, rent-free, because I needed help getting my life together. They had completely rewritten history, claiming credit for my success while painting me as a charity case who owed them everything. I sat in Danny's kitchen, staring at that church bulletin, realizing that my family had not just abandoned me 12 years ago. They had been lying about me for 3 years, taking credit for the house I had bought with money I had earned, while making themselves look like generous, long-suffering parents dealing with an adult child who could not take care of himself. That was when I understood that the phone call demanding my house was not a sudden burst of entitlement. It was the culmination of 3 years of lies they had been telling themselves and everyone else. In their minds, they really did own my house. They had been living in a fantasy where they were the generous benefactors and I was the grateful recipient of their charity. The betrayal cut deeper than anything they had done to me as a teenager. They had not just kicked me out and forgotten about me. They had actively stolen credit for everything I had accomplished, turning my success into their generosity, my independence into their burden, and now they wanted to collect on a debt I had never owed them. The next morning, my phone started ringing at 6 a.m. Mom's tearful voice greeted me before I was fully awake, launching into a speech about family loyalty and sacrifices. She had clearly prepared her talking points overnight. Jake had finally found the right girl, she explained between sniffles. Sarah Williams was a lovely teacher at the local elementary school, and she came from a good family. Jake was ready to settle down and start his adult life, but he needed stability and a proper home to offer her. Mom talked about Sarah like she was some kind of prize that Jake had won, emphasizing how patient and understanding she had been with Jake's slow start in life. According to Mom, Jake had never had the advantages I had. He was not naturally smart like me, did not have my drive and ambition. He had struggled more, needed more support and guidance. Now that he was finally ready to take responsibility, it was my duty as his older brother to help him succeed. The conversation lasted 45 minutes. Mom cried. She guilt-tripped me about how Jake had always looked up to me, how he had felt inadequate growing up in my shadow. She painted a picture of a young man who just needed one break, one chance to prove himself, and I was the only person who could give it to him. When I pointed out that I had worked for everything I owned while Jake had been supported by them for 12 years, Mom got defensive. She said I had always been self-sufficient, had never really needed help, while Jake was more sensitive and required different kinds of support. She made it sound like my independence was a character flaw, rather than something I had been forced into. The phone calls continued every day. Sometimes Mom called during my lunch break, crying about how Jake was finally showing maturity and responsibility. Sometimes she called during my commute home, talking about Sarah's positive influence and how marriage would complete Jake's transformation into a responsible adult. Dad took a different approach. He showed up at Morrison Electric on Thursday afternoon, asking to speak with me privately. My co-workers were curious about the family resemblance, and friendly enough, but I was mortified. Robert Peterson was not the kind of man who made good impressions at professional settings. We sat in his truck in the parking lot, while Dad explained that Jake had a real job opportunity lined up. His friend Rick Kowalski ran a small construction company and was willing to give Jake a supervisor position. Jake just needed stability and a professional address to seal the deal. Living in his childhood bedroom at 32 years old was not exactly impressive to potential employers or future in-laws. Dad talked about Jake like he was a late bloomer who had finally found his direction. He emphasized that Jake had never asked for anything big before, had never expected handouts. This was different, because Jake was ready to take responsibility and build a future with Sarah. When I asked why Jake could not rent his own place, or why they could not help him with a down payment on a modest apartment, Dad got irritated. He said I was missing the point. Family helped family. Jake needed a real house, a place where he could propose to Sarah properly and start planning their future. An apartment was not the same as a home. The conversation got heated when Dad suggested that I was being selfish. He said I was single, had no responsibilities, did not need 3 bedrooms for just myself. Jake and Sarah would actually use the house for its intended purpose, raising a family and building a life together. I told Dad about the church bulletin, about learning that they had been claiming credit for my house. He did not deny it, just said that people had gotten the wrong impression and it was not important. What mattered was doing the right thing now. The manipulation campaign escalated over the weekend. Saturday morning, I was working in my yard when a car pulled into my driveway. Jake got out with a pretty brunette woman and 2 other people I did not recognize. Jake waved cheerfully and called out that he wanted to show Sarah and their friends the house, my house. Not introduce them to me, not ask permission for a tour, show them the house like he already owned it. I stood there with grass clippings on my shoes, watching my brother walk around my property like he was conducting a real estate showing. He pointed out the features of the yard, the size of the garage, the potential for expansion. Sarah nodded and smiled, taking pictures with her phone. The friends, who introduced themselves as Marcus and Jennifer, asked questions about the neighborhood, the local schools, the property taxes. They talked about Jake and Sarah's wedding plans, how beautiful the backyard would be for a reception, how nice it would be to have the whole family together for holidays in such a lovely home. Jake showed them through my front door without knocking. He gave them a complete tour, pointing out which bedroom would be perfect for a nursery, how the living room had great natural light for entertaining, how the kitchen just needed minor updates to be perfect for Sarah's cooking. I followed them through my own house, speechless with shock and anger. Jake talked about his plans for the place like I was not even there. He had already measured the bedrooms, had already decided which room would become his home office, had already planned to convert my current office space into a nursery for future children. Sarah was sweet and enthusiastic, clearly excited about what she thought was their future home. She asked me polite questions about the neighborhood, the local amenities, how long I had been living there. She had no idea that Jake was lying to her about everything. When I finally found my voice and told them they needed to leave, Jake looked genuinely confused. He said they were just looking around, planning for the future. Sarah looked embarrassed and apologized for intruding. But Jake acted like I was being unreasonably territorial about a house that was going to be theirs anyway. As they left, I heard Jake telling Marcus that I was just stressed about the transition, that it was hard for some people to accept change even when it was for the best. He said I would come around once I realized how much happier everyone would be with the new arrangement. That evening, Mom called to scold me for being rude to Sarah. She said I had embarrassed Jake in front of his future wife and their friends, had made the family look dysfunctional and unwelcoming. She wanted me to call Sarah personally and apologize for my attitude. The manipulation was working exactly as they planned it. They were building pressure from multiple angles, creating a narrative where I was the obstacle to Jake's happiness and Sarah's future. They were making me the bad guy for refusing to hand over everything I had worked for to someone who had never earned anything in his life. But the real shock came when I realized that Jake genuinely believed he was entitled to my house. This was not a scheme or a scam in his mind. He had been told by our parents that the house was family property, that I was just living there temporarily, that it would naturally transfer to him when he was ready for it. He had been making plans based on the assumption that my house was his inheritance. The entitlement was breathtaking, but it was also terrifying. If Jake really believed the house was rightfully his, there was no limit to how far he might go to claim it. And, based on the legal papers Mom had mentioned on that first phone call, they were already preparing to escalate this, far beyond family pressure and guilt trips. Monday morning brought a knock on my door that changed everything. A man in an expensive suit stood on my porch with a briefcase and an attitude that immediately set my teeth on edge. He introduced himself as Thomas Wellington, attorney at law, and said he was here on behalf of my parents regarding the family property dispute. I invited him in, more out of curiosity than cooperation. Wellington was probably in his 50s, with perfectly styled gray hair and the kind of confidence that came from years of intimidating people in conference rooms. He spread papers across my kitchen table like he was preparing for a hostile takeover. The legal theory was creative. I had to give them that. According to Wellington, my parents had provided substantial financial assistance for my house purchase, creating what he called an equitable lien on the property. Even though their names were not on the deed or mortgage, they had an ownership interest based on their contributions and could demand compensation or transfer of the property. Wellington presented what he claimed were bank records, showing a $15,000 transfer from my parents to my account 3 years ago. The papers looked official, complete with account numbers and transaction details. There was also a handwritten promissory note, supposedly signed by me, acknowledging the loan and agreeing to transfer the property to Jake when he was ready to settle down. I stared at the documents, feeling like I was looking at evidence of a crime I did not remember committing. The handwriting looked like mine. The signature was close enough to be convincing, and the dates matched up with my house purchase timeline. If I had not known for absolute certain that my parents had never given me a penny, I might have questioned my own memory. Wellington explained that my parents had been generous and patient, allowing me to live in what was essentially their investment property while I got established in my career. Now they needed to recover their investment and provide Jake with the home they had always intended for him. If I refused to cooperate, they would file a lawsuit demanding repayment of the loan plus 3 years of fair market rent for my use of the property. The numbers were staggering. $15,000 for the fake loan, plus interest compounded over 3 years. 36 months of rent at current market rates, which Wellington estimated at about $1,200 per month. Late fees and penalties for non-payment, legal fees and court costs. By his calculation, I owed the family over $60,000. If I could not pay immediately, Wellington suggested that the most reasonable solution would be to transfer the deed to Jake and call it even. Jake would take over the mortgage payments, and everyone could move forward without the expense and embarrassment of a family lawsuit. I told Wellington that I had never received any money from my parents and that the documents were obviously forged. He smiled and said that was a serious accusation to make against family members. He suggested that the stress of the situation might be affecting my memory, and that it would be best to resolve this quietly before emotions escalated further. When I refused to sign anything, Wellington became less friendly. He said that fraud was a serious crime, and that if I had taken my parents' money under false pretenses, I could face criminal charges as well as civil liability. He mentioned that my parents had been documenting my financial irresponsibility for years, and had evidence that I might not be competent to manage my own affairs. After Wellington left, I drove straight to my bank. I needed to secure my account records and make sure no one else had been accessing my financial information. What I discovered there made my blood run cold. The bank representative, a middle-aged woman named Patricia Davis, who had helped me set up my accounts years earlier, pulled my complete financial history. There were no mysterious $15,000 deposits from my parents, which confirmed what I already knew. But there were other problems that made my stomach drop. Someone had been trying to access my accounts. Multiple credit applications had been submitted in my name over the past 6 months, all listing my parents' address as my residence. Patricia showed me copies of applications for credit cards, a personal loan, even an attempt to refinance my mortgage. Most of the applications had been denied because the address did not match my bank records, but 2 credit cards had been approved and were apparently being used. The bills were being sent to my parents' house, which explained why I had never seen them. Patricia walked me through the fraud protection process, but the damage was already significant. My credit score had dropped by over 100 points due to missed payments on accounts I did not know existed. Someone had been using my name and social security number to rack up debt, and they had been smart enough to use an address where I would never see the bills. The bank's security department got involved immediately. They flagged my accounts for additional protection and started the process of investigating the unauthorized applications. But the representative warned me that this type of identity theft was usually committed by family members, and prosecution was often difficult because victims were reluctant to press charges against their own relatives. I left the bank with a growing sense of dread. The legal papers Wellington had shown me were just the beginning. My family had been systematically laying the groundwork for this confrontation for months, maybe years. They had created false documentation, damaged my credit, and built a narrative of financial irresponsibility that could be used against me in court. That evening, I called my parents directly and confronted them about the identity theft. Dad denied everything, said I was being paranoid and looking for excuses to avoid helping Jake. When I mentioned the credit applications and forged documents, he got angry and accused me of trying to frame them for crimes they did not commit. Mom got on the phone and started crying, saying I was breaking her heart by accusing them of fraud when they were only trying to help the family stay together. She said Wellington had warned them that I might make false accusations to avoid taking responsibility for the money they had given me. The conversation ended with Dad threatening to cut off contact permanently if I continued to spread lies about them. He said Jake was a good man who deserved a chance at happiness, and I was being selfish and vindictive by standing in his way. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking at the copies of fraudulent credit applications, realizing that I was not just fighting for my house anymore. I was fighting for my financial future, my reputation, and possibly my freedom. My family had declared war on me, and they had been planning this attack for much longer than I had realized. The worst part was the sophistication of their plan. Someone had put serious thought into creating convincing documentation, accessing my personal information, and building a legal strategy that could actually work. This was not a desperate grab by people in financial trouble. This was a calculated campaign to destroy me and steal everything I had built. But I was about to discover that the identity theft and forged documents were just the surface level of their betrayal. The real scope of what my family had done to me was so much worse than I could have imagined. I spent the next week documenting everything I could remember about my interactions with my family since buying the house. Every phone call, every visit, every conversation that had seemed odd at the time. I was building a timeline, trying to understand when the lies had started and how deep they went. Tuesday morning, I hired Sandra Chen, a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud cases. Sandra came highly recommended by the bank's security department, and she had experience dealing with family-based identity theft. She was small, intense, and had the kind of focused energy that made me think she could find anything if she put her mind to it. I also hired David Park, a financial crimes attorney who had been practicing for 20 years. David was expensive, but he understood the seriousness of what I was facing. If my family had been stealing my identity for months or years, the legal implications went far beyond a civil dispute about property ownership. Sandra started with the credit applications and worked backward from there. Within 3 days, she had uncovered a pattern of fraud that made my stomach sick. My parents had not just stolen my identity recently. They had been using my name and personal information since I bought the house 3 years ago. The first application was submitted just 2 months after I closed on my mortgage. A credit card with a $5,000 limit, approved based on my excellent credit score and steady employment. The bills went to my parents' address, where they had convinced the credit card company that I was temporarily staying with them while renovating my new house. Over 3 years, they had opened 7 different credit accounts in my name. Credit cards, a personal loan, a line of credit attached to my house, even a retail financing account for appliances. The total debt was nearly $30,000, and every payment had been missed or late, destroying my credit score systematically. But the identity theft was just the beginning of what Sandra discovered. My parents had also been intercepting my mail for over a year. They had filled out a change of address form with the Postal Service, claiming that I was temporarily staying with them due to a family emergency. All of my financial statements, tax documents, and legal notices had been redirected to their house, where they could monitor and control what I saw. David's investigation into the legal documents revealed even more fraud. The promissory note that Wellington had shown me was not just a forgery. It was created using stolen letterhead from my bank and featured a notary seal that belonged to a notary who had died 2 years ago. Someone had put significant time and effort into creating convincing false documentation. The bank records showing the $15,000 loan were also fabricated. David traced the account numbers to accounts that existed, but the transaction histories had been altered using sophisticated document editing software. The level of technical skill required suggested that this was not just my parents acting alone. Sandra's background check on Thomas Wellington revealed the next piece of the puzzle. Wellington was a real attorney, but he specialized in bankruptcy and debt collection, not family law. He had been hired by someone with cash to create legal pressure without asking too many questions about the underlying claims. More concerning, Wellington had been in contact with my parents for over 6 months. Sandra found records of multiple meetings, phone calls, and document exchanges going back to last spring. This was not a recent decision to pressure me for the house. This was a long-term plan that had been in development for most of a year. But the most devastating discovery came when Sandra investigated Jake's financial situation. My brother was not just unemployed and looking for stability. He was in serious financial trouble that went far beyond normal job struggles. Jake owed over $15,000 to various creditors around town. Payday loan companies, online gambling sites, and at least 2 individuals who Sandra described as loan sharks. Jake had been betting on sports and playing online poker, using borrowed money to chase losses that kept getting bigger. The teaching job that his girlfriend Sarah thought he had was completely fictional. Jake had been leaving the house every morning dressed for work, but he spent his days at internet cafes and sports bars, gambling online and watching games. Sarah had no idea that her boyfriend was unemployed and deep in debt to dangerous people. But Sarah was not as innocent as she appeared. Sandra's investigation revealed that Sarah Williams was not an elementary school teacher. She was a paralegal who had been working part-time for Thomas Wellington for the past year. Sarah had been gathering information about me, my house, my financial situation, and my daily routines, while pretending to be Jake's loving girlfriend. The entire romance was a setup. Sarah had been introduced to Jake specifically to create a reason for him to need a family home. She had been coached to play the role of a stable, successful woman who could motivate Jake to settle down and take responsibility. The wedding plans, the house tour, even the sweet questions about the neighborhood had all been part of an intelligence-gathering operation. David discovered that my parents' financial situation was even worse than Jake's. Robert and Carol Peterson owed over $60,000 in back taxes, mortgage payments, and credit card debt. Their house was in foreclosure, and they had been served with eviction notices that would take effect in 60 days. Their plan was never just about getting me to give Jake my house. They intended to sell my house and use the money to pay off their own debts and avoid bankruptcy. Sarah's real estate background had helped them research my property value and identify potential buyers. They had been planning to list my house for sale within weeks of getting the deed transferred. But the final revelation was the most personal betrayal of all. My cousin Emma, whom I had helped pay for college and considered one of the few family members I still trusted, had been secretly recording our conversations for months at my parents' request. Emma had visited me regularly over the past year, always bringing up topics about my stress levels, my job pressures, my feelings about family relationships. I had thought she was being a caring cousin, checking on my well-being and offering emotional support. Instead, she was gathering evidence that could be used to portray me as mentally unstable and unable to manage my own affairs. The recordings had been edited and compiled into a package that made me sound paranoid, anxious, and possibly suffering from depression or other mental health issues. My parents had been planning to use this manufactured evidence to support a legal claim that I was not competent to own property or make financial decisions. Sandra played me some of the recordings, and I could barely recognize my own voice. Emma had been skilled at asking leading questions and creating contexts that made my normal responses sound like symptoms of mental illness. Conversations about work stress, had been edited to sound like paranoid rants. Discussions about family relationships had been manipulated to suggest that I had an unstable and hostile personality. The scope of the betrayal was overwhelming. My parents, my brother, my cousin, and even Jake's girlfriend had all been working together to create a false narrative that would justify stealing my house and destroying my life. They had been planning this for at least a year, possibly longer, building evidence and documentation that could support their legal claims. But what made it even worse was the realization that Jake genuinely did not understand the full scope of what was happening. His gambling addiction and financial desperation had made him willing to believe that he was entitled to my house, but he was not the mastermind of the identity theft and fraud. He was another victim of our parents' manipulation, used as a pawn in their scheme to avoid their own financial collapse. As I sat in David's office, looking at bank records and credit reports, and legal documents that proved my family had been systematically destroying my life, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and betrayal were still there, but they were being replaced by something colder and more focused. They had made one critical mistake in their planning. They had assumed that I would be too shocked, too hurt, too afraid of family conflict to fight back effectively. They thought I would cave under pressure and give them what they wanted to make the pain stop. They had no idea that 12 years of surviving without them had taught me how to be ruthless when necessary. And they were about to find out exactly how far I was willing to go to protect myself and everything I had worked for. Just when I thought I had uncovered the worst of my family's deception, a certified letter arrived that made everything else look like amateur hour. The envelope bore the seal of the Hamilton County Probate Court, and my hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a petition for guardianship, filed by Robert and Carol Peterson, requesting to be appointed as legal guardians for their adult son Herman Peterson due to his inability to manage his personal and financial affairs. The petition claimed I was suffering from severe mental illness that impaired my judgment and made me a danger to myself and others. I read the document 3 times before the full implications sank in. My parents were trying to have me declared mentally incompetent. If they succeeded, they would gain complete legal control over my finances, my property, and major decisions about my life. They could sell my house, access my bank accounts, even have me committed to a psychiatric facility if they deemed it necessary for my well-being. The supporting documentation was extensive and terrifyingly convincing. Medical records from Dr. Toman, Patricia Hensley, a psychiatrist I had never heard of, detailed multiple appointments where I had allegedly been treated for severe depression, anxiety, and paranoid delusions. The records described me as increasingly unstable, unable to maintain relationships, and showing signs of persecution complex and financial irresponsibility. There were pharmacy records showing prescriptions for antipsychotic medications and antidepressants that I had supposedly been taking for the past 2 years. Insurance claims for mental health services. Even a suicide risk assessment that recommended immediate family intervention to prevent self-harm. Every document looked official and legitimate. The medical records included detailed notes about my behavior, my statements during therapy sessions, and my responses to treatment. If I had not known that I had never seen a psychiatrist in my life, I would have found the evidence compelling. David Park immediately filed an emergency motion to contest the guardianship petition and demanded a hearing. But he warned me that these cases could take months to resolve, and during that time, the court might impose temporary restrictions on my ability to access my own accounts or make major financial decisions. Sandra Chen worked around the clock to investigate how my parents had created such convincing, false medical records. What she discovered was a sophisticated network of fraud that went far beyond anything we had imagined. Dr. Patricia Hensley was a real psychiatrist, but she had been treating my cousin Emma, not me. Emma had been struggling with anxiety and depression related to her college stress and family pressures. Someone had taken Emma's real medical records and systematically altered them, changing names, dates, and personal details to make it appear that I was the patient receiving treatment. The pharmacy records were created using Emma's prescription history as well. Emma had been prescribed antidepressants and anxiety medication during her junior year of college, when she was dealing with academic pressure and relationship problems. Those legitimate prescriptions had been doctored to show my name and address instead of hers. But Emma was not just an unwitting victim whose records had been stolen. Sandra's investigation revealed that Emma had been an active participant in creating the false evidence. She had been saving copies of her therapy notes, prescription bottles, and insurance statements specifically so they could be altered and used against me. When Sandra confronted Emma directly, she broke down and confessed everything. Emma had been struggling financially since graduating college, and my parents had offered to pay off her student loans if she helped them gather evidence to prove I was mentally unstable. The recording sessions in my house had been just part of her assignment. Emma had also been coached to exaggerate her mental health struggles during her real therapy sessions, creating more dramatic and concerning documentation that could be repurposed for my fake medical file. She had deliberately mentioned symptoms and behaviors that would make the records more compelling when transferred to my name. The betrayal cut deeper than anything else my family had done. I had paid for Emma's college expenses because I believed in her potential and wanted to help her avoid the student debt that had crushed so many of our friends. I had trusted her with my feelings, my struggles, my vulnerabilities during our conversations, and she had been weaponizing everything I told her to destroy my life. But the investigation revealed an even more disturbing truth. Sarah Williams, Jake's supposed girlfriend, was not just gathering information for the property theft. She was the technical expert who had been creating and editing the fraudulent documents. Her paralegal training included experience with medical records, legal documents, and digital evidence management. Sarah had been using her access to Thomas Wellington's law firm resources to create convincing forgeries. She had software for editing documents, templates for medical forms, and knowledge of how to make fabricated evidence look authentic. The entire false medical history had been crafted by someone who understood exactly how these records were normally formatted and processed. The relationship with Jake was completely fake. Sarah was actually in a long-term relationship with a man named Kevin Torres, and they had been planning to use the money from my house sale to start their own legal services business. Jake was just a useful tool for accessing my family and gathering information about my vulnerabilities. Sarah had been studying me for months, learning my routines, my personality, my relationships. She knew which emotional triggers would be most effective, which family members I trusted, and how to position herself as a sympathetic figure who could extract information without arousing suspicion. But the most devastating revelation came when Sandra investigated the timing of the guardianship petition. My parents had been planning this for over a year, long before Jake's supposed readiness to settle down and start a family. The entire narrative about Jake needing a house for his future with Sarah had been created to provide cover for their real plan, seizing control of my assets to pay their own debts. The guardianship petition was their nuclear option, designed to give them complete legal authority over my life if the property fraud and identity theft did not work. If they could have me declared incompetent, they could sell my house, drain my bank accounts, and even commit me to an institution where I could not fight back. David's legal research revealed that guardianship fraud was increasingly common in cases involving family financial disputes. Adult children with assets were being targeted by relatives who created false evidence of mental illness or addiction to gain control of their property. The legal system was often slow to investigate these claims, especially when the petitioners were close family members who appeared genuinely concerned about their loved one's welfare. The hearing was scheduled for the following month, but David warned me that the court might impose temporary protective measures based on the medical evidence. I could be restricted from accessing my bank accounts, prohibited from making major financial decisions, or even required to undergo psychological evaluation by a court-appointed expert. As I sat in David's office, looking at the pile of fabricated medical records and fraudulent documents that my family had created to destroy me, I realized that this was not just about greed or entitlement. This was about power and control. My parents could not accept that I had succeeded without them, that I had built a life they could not touch or manipulate. By trying to have me declared incompetent, they were attempting to retroactively undo my independence and autonomy. They wanted to reduce me back to the 18-year-old boy they had kicked out, helpless and dependent on their mercy. But they had made a critical error in their planning. They had become so focused on creating convincing lies that they had forgotten to cover their tracks. And I was about to show them exactly what happened when they underestimated the person they were trying to destroy. The guardianship petition was their final betrayal, but it was also going to be their downfall, because in their rush to seize control of my assets, they had committed federal crimes that carried serious prison sentences. And unlike family disputes over property, federal prosecutors did not care about maintaining family relationships or finding compromises. They wanted to play legal hardball with fabricated evidence and false medical records. I was about to teach them that there were consequences for that level of fraud. Consequences that would destroy their lives just as thoroughly as they had tried to destroy mine. I called my mother on a Thursday evening and told her I was tired of fighting. My voice cracked with what sounded like exhaustion and defeat as I explained that the stress was affecting my health and my job performance. I said I had been thinking about what Wellington had told me, about the potential legal costs and the embarrassment of a family lawsuit, and maybe it would be better for everyone if we just worked something out. Mom's voice immediately brightened with relief and triumph. She said she knew I would come around once I realized that family was more important than money or property. She started talking about how proud she was that I was finally putting Jake's needs first, how this would bring our family back together, and how much happier everyone would be once this was resolved. I told her I wanted to meet with everyone at once to finalize the arrangements. Wellington, my parents, Jake, Sarah, even Emma if she wanted to be there for moral support. I said I needed to understand exactly what was expected of me and get everything documented properly, so there would not be any misunderstandings later. Mom was eager to arrange the meeting. She suggested Wellington's office the following Monday afternoon and said she would call everyone to make sure they could attend. She kept thanking me for being reasonable and mature about the situation, for putting family harmony ahead of my own selfish desires. What my mother did not know was that I had spent the previous week working with Sandra Chen and David Park to build an airtight case against my entire family. Every fraudulent document, every fake medical record, every instance of identity theft had been documented and verified. More importantly, we had involved the Federal Bureau of Investigation. David had contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit after discovering the scope of the fraud against me. Agent Maria Santos had been investigating similar cases of family-based identity theft and guardianship fraud, and she was very interested in the sophisticated level of document forgery and medical records falsification that my family had employed. The FBI had been monitoring my family's communications for the past 2 weeks. Emma had agreed to cooperate with law enforcement in exchange for immunity from prosecution, and she had been wearing a recording device during her conversations with my parents and Sarah Williams. The recordings captured detailed discussions of their plans, their methods, and their intentions to liquidate my assets. Agent Santos explained that my family had committed multiple federal crimes: identity theft, mail fraud, wire fraud, forgery of government documents, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud. The fake medical records alone carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in prison, since they involved falsifying federal health insurance documents. But the most serious charge was the guardianship fraud. Attempting to have someone declared incompetent using fabricated evidence was considered a form of kidnapping under federal law, since it involved depriving someone of their liberty and legal rights through criminal deception. The FBI had also discovered that Sarah Williams and Thomas Wellington were part of a larger criminal network that specialized in guardianship fraud. They had been targeting elderly people and adults with disabilities, creating fake medical evidence to justify guardianships that allowed them to steal assets from vulnerable victims. My family had stumbled into a professional criminal operation when they hired Wellington to handle their legal pressure campaign. Sarah was not just Jake's fake girlfriend or a paralegal helping with document forgery. She was a career criminal who had been running guardianship scams for over 3 years. The meeting at Wellington's office was actually going to take place at an FBI field office that had been set up to look like a law firm. Agent Santos and her team would be recording everything and making arrests as soon as my family attempted to complete the fraudulent property transfer. Monday afternoon, I arrived at what my family thought was Wellington's office, but was actually a federal law enforcement facility. The conference room was equipped with hidden cameras and recording equipment, and FBI agents were positioned throughout the building. My parents arrived first, dressed in their best clothes and carrying folders full of documents. Mom hugged me and said how relieved she was that we were finally going to resolve everything. Dad shook my hand and said he was proud of me for doing the right thing for the family. Jake and Sarah arrived together, with Jake looking nervous but excited about finally getting his house. Sarah was professional and calm, carrying a briefcase full of legal papers and transfer documents. She had already prepared everything for my signature, including new deeds and mortgage transfer forms. Emma came last, looking pale and anxious. She had been struggling with her role as an FBI informant, but she understood that cooperation was her only chance to avoid serious federal charges. Wellington started the meeting by reviewing the legal situation and the proposed resolution. He presented the fabricated evidence of my parents' financial contribution to my house purchase, the fake promissory note with my forged signature, and the manufactured medical records supporting their guardianship petition. As Wellington explained each document, Agent Santos and her team were recording everything. Every false statement, every fraudulent claim, every attempt to use fabricated evidence to steal my property was being captured in high-definition video with crystal-clear audio. The moment of truth came when Wellington presented the final transfer documents and asked me to sign the deed over to Jake. Instead of reaching for a pen, I looked directly at my parents and asked them if they were sure they wanted to go through with this. Dad said of course they were sure, that this was what was best for the whole family. Mom added that they had put a lot of time and effort into resolving this situation, and it was time for everyone to move forward. That was when I smiled and told them they were absolutely right. It was time for everyone to move forward. And then I told them exactly who they were really dealing with. Agent Santos entered the room with her badge and identification, followed by 6 other federal agents. As my family sat in stunned silence, she announced that they were all under arrest for conspiracy to commit mail fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, and attempted guardianship fraud. The look on my parents' faces was worth every moment of pain they had put me through. The entitled confidence evaporated instantly, replaced by panic and confusion as the agents began reading them their rights. Sarah Williams tried to run but was immediately detained in the hallway. Her briefcase full of forged documents became evidence of her role in the criminal conspiracy. Jake broke down crying, finally realizing that his parents had been using him as a pawn in a criminal scheme, and that his entire relationship with Sarah had been a lie designed to manipulate him. Wellington was arrested as well, though he immediately started demanding his lawyer and claiming that he had been deceived by his clients about the validity of their claims. As the agents led my family away in handcuffs, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because justice was finally being served, but sadness because this was really the end of any possibility of having a real family relationship with these people. Emma was not arrested, since she had been cooperating with law enforcement, but she apologized to me with tears streaming down her face, begging me to understand that she had been desperate and scared when my parents offered to help her with her student loans. I told Emma that I understood desperation, since I had been desperate when they kicked me out at 18, but I had chosen to work harder rather than betray the people who cared about me. Her choices had consequences, and those consequences would include losing my trust and support permanently. The FBI investigation revealed that my family's crimes were just the beginning of what they had planned. They had been researching other family members with assets, including my grandmother's savings and my aunt's retirement account. I was not their only target, just their first target. But their criminal careers were over before they really began. And in trying to destroy my life to save their own, they had succeeded only in destroying themselves completely. The legal proceedings moved swiftly once the FBI completed their investigation. Robert Peterson was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for identity theft, mail fraud, and conspiracy. The judge was particularly harsh because of the sophisticated nature of the fraud and the fact that he had targeted his own son. Carol Peterson received 3 years of probation and was required to pay full restitution for the credit card debt and financial damage caused by the identity theft. The judge considered her a follower rather than a leader in the conspiracy, but made it clear that family relationships did not excuse criminal behavior. Sarah Williams was sentenced to 7 years in prison as a repeat offender who had been running guardianship fraud schemes across 3 states. Her prosecution led to the discovery of 12 other victims, mostly elderly people whose assets had been stolen through fake medical evidence and fraudulent competency proceedings. Thomas Wellington lost his law license and received 3 years in prison for his role in the document forgery and conspiracy. The State Bar Association launched a broader investigation into lawyers who had been facilitating guardianship fraud, leading to additional prosecutions and license revocations. Jake Peterson was not charged criminally, since the FBI determined that he had been manipulated by the other conspirators and was unaware of the extent of their fraud. However, his gambling addiction and financial desperation had made him a willing participant in what he thought was just aggressive family pressure rather than criminal activity. Jake enrolled in a residential treatment program for gambling addiction, paid for by the court-ordered restitution from our parents. He wrote me a letter 6 months later, taking full responsibility for his sense of entitlement and his blindness to our parents' manipulation. He acknowledged that he had never earned anything in his life and had been living in a fantasy where other people owed him success and happiness. The letter was thoughtful and seemed genuine, but I was not ready to forgive him. Years of entitlement and selfishness could not be erased by one program and one apology. If Jake wanted to rebuild any kind of relationship with me, he would need to prove through sustained action that he had genuinely changed. My credit score was completely restored within 6 months, and I received financial compensation for the damages caused by the identity theft. The FBI's Asset Forfeiture Division recovered some money from Sarah Williams's criminal activities, which helped cover my legal expenses and the costs of repairing my financial reputation. More importantly, the case became part of a broader federal initiative to crack down on guardianship, fraud, and family-based financial exploitation. Agent Santos told me that my willingness to prosecute my own parents had set an important precedent for other victims who were afraid to take legal action against family members. My parents' house went into foreclosure as scheduled, and they lost everything. I did not intervene or offer assistance. They had made their choices, and they could live with the consequences of those choices. Emma's student loans remained her responsibility as well, since she had chosen to betray my trust rather than ask me for help directly. But the most meaningful outcome was not the criminal prosecutions or the financial recovery. It was the realization that I did not need my family's approval or love to have a complete and successful life. I used part of the restitution money to create the Independent Start Scholarship, a fund that provides financial assistance to young people who have aged out of foster care or been kicked out by their families. The scholarship covers not just tuition and books, but also housing, transportation, and emergency expenses that can derail a young person's education. I partnered with my college's engineering program to provide mentorship and career guidance to scholarship recipients. Many of them reminded me of myself at 18. Determined, hard-working, but lacking the family safety net that most of their peers took for granted. The scholarship program also connected me with other successful adults who had overcome family rejection and abuse. I discovered a community of people who had built meaningful lives despite, or perhaps because of, their difficult family relationships. Last month, I hosted a barbecue in my backyard for the scholarship recipients, my coworkers from Morrison Electric, and the chosen family I had built over the years. Danny Morrison and his wife brought their 2 kids, who love playing in my yard and call me Uncle Herman. Emma's former roommate Katie, who had become a good friend after learning about Emma's betrayal, helped me prepare food and organize games. Agent Maria Santos stopped by with her husband and daughter, and we talked about the other cases that had developed from the investigation into my family's crimes. 3 other families had been exposed for similar fraud schemes, and dozens of victims had been able to recover their stolen assets. As I watched my friends and chosen family laughing and enjoying themselves in the space that my parents had tried to steal from me, I felt a sense of peace that I had never experienced before. My house was full of people who celebrated my success instead of trying to steal it, who supported my goals instead of undermining them, who chose to be part of my life because they valued me as a person. That evening, after everyone had gone home and I was cleaning up the dishes, I thought about the 18-year-old boy who had slept in his car because his family had no space for him. He could never have imagined that losing his family would eventually lead to finding a much better family. The final life lesson was not about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about recognizing your own worth and surrounding yourself with people who enhance your life instead of diminishing it. Sometimes the greatest gift your family can give you is showing you exactly who they really are, so you can choose to build something better. I spent years thinking I needed my family's approval and love to feel complete. What I really needed was to recognize my own value and create relationships with people who saw and appreciated that value. Family is not just about blood relations. Family is about the people who show up for you, support your dreams, and celebrate your successes without trying to claim credit for them. My parents taught me that some people will always see your success as something they deserve rather than something you earned. My brother taught me that entitlement can blind you to your own potential. But my chosen family taught me that there are people in this world who will value you for exactly who you are and support you in becoming exactly who you want to be. And that lesson, painful as it was to learn, transformed my life in ways that no amount of family acceptance ever could have. Now I want to ask you something that I have been thinking about since this whole experience ended. Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace with family members and protecting yourself from their harmful behavior? How did you handle the pressure to forgive people who had seriously betrayed your trust? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know if you think I made the right choices in dealing with my family's betrayal. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like to help it reach other people who might be struggling with similar family conflicts. Subscribe to hear more stories about overcoming difficult family relationships and building a life on your own terms. And share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they are not obligated to accept abuse or manipulation just because it comes from family members. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of a community that understands the value of choosing your own path in life. I hope my experience can help you recognize your own worth and find the courage to protect yourself from people who do not have your best interests at heart, no matter what their relationship to you might be. Remember, you deserve to be surrounded by people who celebrate your success, not people who try to steal it from you.